Well, hello and welcome everybody. We are right on 12 on the dot here. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our introductions and our welcome. My name is Holly Borum, and this book party is sponsored by the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, which is associated with the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. The purpose of these book parties is to celebrate the wonderful work of our fellows, and today we're going to be hearing from Senior Fellow Joel Anderson. So at this point, just a reminder to keep yourself muted until the Q&A. And as you can see, this is being recorded and will be available eventually on the RBS website. So for introductions, today we're going to be hearing from Joel Anderson, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Maine. He is a historian of medieval Europe with broad interests in cultural history, religious history, and the Norse world. He received a bachelor's degree from Bates College and subsequently studied at the University of Oslo, the University of Iceland, and Cornell University, where he completed his PhD. Joel's research revolves around issues of communication, imagination, and authority, particularly in the High and Late Medieval Church. Joel will be interviewed by Damian Fleming. Damian is a past president of the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography and associate professor of English and linguistics at Purdue University, Fort Wayne, where he teaches ancient and medieval literature, Latin, and directs the minor in medieval studies. He majored in medieval studies at Fordham University before pursuing his PhD in early English at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on perceptions of Hebrew among early medieval Christians, especially in the islands of the North Atlantic. So for our format today, Damian will lead the conversation with Joel. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat as we go along. In about 40 minutes, Damian will wrap up and I'll start posing your questions to Joel. You're also welcome at that time to come off mute and ask as well, so either in the chat or out loud, and I'll remind us all of that later. So at this stage, I'm going to pass this over to Damian and Joel. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone.
Thank you so much, Holly. And thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you, Joel. I think I want to start things off by handing things over to Joel and invite you to just introduce your book and kind of contextualize it a little bit.
Yes, very happy to do that. Thank you very much to Holly for that introduction, and thank you, of course, to Damian for hosting this conversation, and thank you to you all for attending. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Great. How does that look? Good. All right, wonderful. So I wanted to start by just talking about a few things. First, the title of the book, some basic orientation on its chronology, its geography, and its main source material. And then I'll conclude my very brief introduction with what I see as the book's main historiographic contributions. So first, the title, Reimagining Christendom, Writing Iceland's Bishops into the Roman Church. I chose this title, Reimagining Christendom, because it signals in, I think, at least two directions, some of the book's main ideas and arguments. Two senses of reimagining Christendom. First, one of the central contentions of the book is that Icelandic writers in the 13th and 14th centuries reimagined what it meant to belong to Christendom. And Christendom throughout the book functions as a kind of convenient shorthand for Christian society as led by the Roman Church. So one of my key contentions is that Icelandic sources portray Christendom as an entity that emerged as much through the kind of imaginative engagement on display in Icelandic sources, so imaginative engagement on the periphery, as it did through Rome's central ordering. So that's one sense of reimagining Christendom, Icelandic clerics reimagining what it meant to belong to this entity. The other sense of reimagining Christendom that I hope that this title gets at is the sense that Icelandic portrayals of Christendom can help us as scholars in the 21st century reimagine or reinterpret or reevaluate our own senses of the characteristics of high medieval Christendom. Okay, some quick orientation. The book's chronology, its dates, as in the title, are from roughly 1200 to 1350. This is an era that's been closely associated with the age of the so-called papal monarchy. The idea there being the Pope rules over the church just as a king rules over his kingdom. So a sort of standard narrative of this era is that the Roman Church formed a strong center that gradually but inexorably extended its authority through its bureaucratic and legal apparatuses over peripheral churches like the church in Iceland, and in the process produced a more homogeneous society, Christendom. So my initial interest was essentially how did this process play out in the Nordic world, which brings me to the geography of this book. I'm interested in what I call the Roman Church in the Nordic world. Here, a map from the book, hand-drawn by the very capable John Wyatt Greenlee, which shows you the main sort of sites of ecclesiastical authority in the Norse world. From the mid-12th century, there is an archiepiscopal see at a place called Nidaros, modern-day Trondheim on the west coast of Norway. And that archiepiscopal see is, of course, subordinate to Rome, but is itself responsible for supervising bishoprics in Norway, and then these far-flung overseas bishoprics as well, places like Kirkjubøur in the Faroe Islands, Garðar out in Greenland, and two episcopal sees in Iceland, one in the north at a place called Hólar, and one in the south at a place called Skalholt. My book's primary source material is a group of texts that are collectively known as the Bishop's Sagas. These are essentially biographies of Iceland's bishops written in the 13th and 14th centuries. And as I read these stories, I found that they portrayed a much more complex and nuanced and interesting representation of Iceland's incorporation into Christendom during this era. One in which Icelandic churchmen both aligned themselves with Roman authority, but also were very capable of repurposing it for local ends that did not match the ideas and agendas of the church's central planners. So to give just a few examples that are treated in considerably more detail in the book, Icelandic sources draw on papal documents and canon law to argue for the licitness and the legitimacy of, for instance, a bishop who was married not once, but twice. And the authors wanted to claim that he was a saint as well. They argue for the legitimacy of a bishop who went around Iceland consecrating miracle-working wells and springs. And they argue for the legitimacy of a king of Norway who was in fact excommunicated by the papacy. So to put things somewhat bluntly, I think Icelandic writers kind of wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to argue that they were good, upstanding members of the Roman Church, but they also wanted to preserve the irregularities and idiosyncrasies of their local church at the same time. How this contributes to some broader scholarly conversations and historiographic discussions. I think my book gives a new portrayal of Iceland's place within the Roman Church. There's been a strain of historical interpretation that has seen the Icelandic Church's incorporation into the Roman Church in the 13th and 14th centuries as something of a foregone conclusion, a kind of destination that was reached through the renunciation of traditional norms and the imposition of Roman discipline. And as I was just saying a moment ago, I see a much more complicated picture, one in which Icelandic clerics were determined to preserve the idiosyncrasies and irregularities of their own church, even as they align themselves with the broader culture of Latin Europe. More broadly, I hope this book also contributes to ongoing discussions about the nature and character of Christendom in the High Middle Ages. There's an older strain of historiography that has seen the Roman Church of the 13th and 14th centuries as Europe's sort of preeminent homogenizing force, a machine almost, that produced uniformity and forged it from diversity. And my book argues that a much more flexible interpretation of Christendom emerges when the practices of Roman government are examined from the vantage point of Iceland. The point that I make, or try to make several times in the book, is that the sort of ongoing centralization of decision-making authority in Rome in this era, in fact, went hand in hand with local forms of exceptionalism, such as we see in Iceland. And last but not least, I hope this book also contributes to scholarly discussions about the nature and effects of document-based governance in the High Middle Ages. I think the book diverges from a scholarly tradition that sees the rise of bureaucratic and proto-bureaucratic governance as being associated with the growth of great organizations, such as the Roman Church, that were capable of subjecting distant regions to central control. The book argues that documents emanating from Rome and other sites of ecclesiastical authority were both a charged and also unpredictable medium of governance. Unpredictable, in some senses unreliable, because, for instance, papal bulls could be easily forged, and there are many examples of this that I discuss in the text. But not only that, papal bulls could also be misconstrued by their recipients, or they could be recontextualized, as we see often in examples in the bishop sagas, recontextualized in narratives, so that these documents served the agendas of local authorities rather than central ones. So that's what I wanted to say in terms of introduction to the book. Thank you all again for attending this event. I sincerely appreciate it. And thanks very much to Damien for hosting this conversation. I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Joel. I gotta say, your book, I loved reading it. You know, seems rare that you like sit down and read a book cover to cover unless you're doing something like preparing for something like this or reviewing a book. But I was so excited because it threw me back to things I have not thought about in a long time, in two very different ways. One was thinking about Icelandic material, which Joel and I have talked about this. I specialize in Old English literature. There's a long tradition of people who specialize in Old English and Germanic philology. Often you learn Norse as like a side thing, where clearly, Joel, your work is like centering these Norse materials. So that's exciting. Then the second thing that it got me thinking back to is, like Holly said in my introduction, I was an undergraduate medieval studies major. And way back then, I used to like read history all the time, and I was, really interested in the High Middle Ages. Old English stuff, it's a completely different world than the High Middle Ages, and we're not really thinking about, papal authority as much. And so there's this conflicting place, I think, of Norse materials often in a broader scholarly world, is that it's often lumped with earlier stuff because of its connection to Germanic philology. But the historical reality is most of these documents and the history that it's telling is part of the High Middle Ages and connected to Europe in that time period. Very different time periods. And I wonder if you could kind of speak a little bit to each of these things. On the one hand, a lot of people who go into studying Old Norse are interested in either the family sagas. So, like, if you know anything about Icelandic literature, you might know about things like Njal Saga and Laxdala Saga. And these are the things that people are more likely to encounter if you're not an Old Norse specialist. Or you'd know about the Eddas, either the prose Edda, where Snorri describes poetry, or the poetic Edda, if you're into mythology and you want to know about Odin and Loki and all of those things. So there's that whole world, which your book is not dealing with at all. And then there's the secondary half, which is, high medieval history, high medieval legal history and documentary history. So yeah, I wonder, just because I'm not sure the backgrounds of our audience here, of just maybe if people know about Norse stuff, maybe they know about this other stuff, and how you would connect what you're looking at or show how it's not connected to this other like body of Icelandic materials.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Damien. I think that's very true that many people get interested in Norse material through the sagas of Icelanders, through the Eddas, through Norse mythology, so on and so forth. And the reality, of course, is that these texts that I'm writing about, the bishop sagas, are essentially written down. They're put on parchment in the same era as those more famous materials are as well. So yeah. As much as the Eddas and the family sagas often, as you say, get lumped into the world of kind of pre-Christian Europe and Germanic mythology and things like that, they are in fact products of the 13th and 14th centuries, as the texts that I'm writing about in this book are as well. So the texts that I'm writing about, these sagas of bishops, belong to the same movement to write down vernacular literature in the Nordic world that also produced the Eddas and their more famous sagas, the family sagas, that is. But of course, the bishop sagas don't really concern themselves very much, at least, with the pagan past, with the kind of legendary heroic past, however you want to frame that. And I think as a result, they've attracted considerably less scholarly attention. So from my perspective, that was a positive. That was something that drew me to them, because like many medievalists, I'm interested in the sort of strange and esoteric. But as I read these sagas, it became clear to me, especially as I was going through graduate school at Cornell, that there was a kind of broad historical context that they needed to be put within, namely the context of high medieval Europe and the growth of writing, the growth of government, the growth of law, the growth of the Roman Church, so on and so forth. So at a just kind of basic level, it seemed to me that there were materials in the form of canon law and papal documents that could be productively put into dialogue with the bishop sagas, for the simple reason that this material sort of specifies what a bishop is supposed to be, how he's supposed to behave, what the kind of expectations are for his conduct, so on and so forth. And it was pretty clear that those expectations didn't exactly match up with the bishops that were governing out in Iceland. And so what I became interested in, and really one of the primary threads that the book follows, is how these writers of the bishop sagas dealt with those cognitive dissonances and dealt with those contradictions. So how can it be, for instance, that Jon Ogmundarson, who's a bishop who opens up the book, how can it be that he's both a good bishop and a saint, but as everyone in Iceland knows, he was also married not once, but twice during his lifetime? And the way that his biographers solve this dilemma is they invent a story in which prior to his consecration as bishop, he goes off to Rome and supposedly receives a dispensation that allows him to become a bishop in spite of his 2 marriages. So as I say, it's a kind of way of having your cake and eating it too. So arguing that Jon was a good, upstanding member of the Roman Church, but acknowledging that he was also married not once, but twice. So yeah, that's hopefully a kind of response to the question, in the sense that it positions the bishop sagas in relation to their more famous family sagas and Eddas, but also positions the bishop sagas in relation to broader European culture at the time. And the latter relationship is really what the book explores in considerable detail.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so fascinating, exactly cases like that. And as you show throughout the book, how on the one hand, these bishop sagas are telling, I feel like, what would feel like very Icelandic kinds of stories, where like there's this Icelandic exceptionalism of, they're like, literally, because they're being granted exceptions for things that no one else should be allowed to do. These Icelandic bishops are allowed to do. These stories tell themselves. But like you said, these materials, like the bishop sagas, are greatly understudied. We were joking before this about how back when I took Old Norse, my professor said, you know what you should do, which nobody does? You should read the bishop sagas. And I did not take them up on that. And I never read any bishop sagas. And I don't even know that I've ever read about the bishop sagas until I read your book. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, these are full of all kinds of amazing stories. How did you end up reading the bishop sagas?
Good question. I was introduced to the bishop sagas as a master's student, or I should say a Fulbright student, studying at the University of Oslo. And I met someone there who was doing a thesis on Guðmundur Arason, who's a bishop who winds up figuring quite prominently in my own book. And so I was attracted to these texts because I think I've always been interested in religious history, and especially religion as a kind of social force in the world. And as I was saying earlier, I was also very attracted to the esotericness of these sagas and the fact that they really hadn't been studied very much. So I wound up writing a master's thesis on Guðmundur and his holy water, his holy wells, which show up throughout Iceland according to his sagas. And I think so it was a combination of that initial grounding in the bishop sagas and then the work I did as a graduate student at Cornell, which was, I think, much more directed towards thinking about the broader context for Icelandic history and Icelandic literature in this period of the 13th and 14th centuries, and situating these sagas, as I was saying earlier, within some of the broader narratives of that period about the era of the papal monarchy or the rise of document-based forms of governance and things of that nature. And thinking about those broad historical narratives in dialogue with what I was seeing in the bishop sagas were what made me pursue this as a dissertation and then ultimately a book project. And I will say, since I have a captive audience here, like these texts are actually quite fun. They're interesting, they're inventive, they're really quirky. Some of them are quite well-constructed narratives, so they're more than worthy of scholarly attention, certainly worthy of more scholarly attention than they've received to date. So my book is a small effort in trying to open these stories up to a broader audience. Unfortunately, some new translations are coming out or have come out in recent years as well that I think will do quite a bit to further the study of these particular sagas.
So jumping on one of the particular points you brought up, something like who's a Guðmundur, who went around, one of the problems that, say, the wider non-Icelandic church would have with his behavior is he did something like he would go around and bless wells, which makes me think, again, thinking of like kind of the maybe a broad stereotypical way that if people think about Iceland, you know, not Norse scholars, but people generally think about Iceland, like the stereotypes associated with Iceland or Icelandic history is like, well, there's like, it's a land of lots of folk beliefs, and it's a land where, you know, like paganism, you know, never fully disappeared. These are the types of things. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about this, the blessing of wells, like how that either is aligned with that type of maybe stereotypical kind of image of Icelanders, you know, believing in elves and things.
Is everyone still with me?
I genuinely don't know.
Okay, great. Damien, sorry you cut off for just a second there, but I think I caught it. Yes, Guðmundur and his holy wells. This is, I think, an instance of Icelandic sources, Icelandic Christian sources, sort of dealing with folk culture and folk beliefs in the sense that Guðmundur is, it's just hard to say. Perhaps his blessing of holy wells has some kind of resonance with pre-Christian beliefs of some kind. On the other hand, he's doing this some 200 plus years after the Christianization of Iceland. But he also does battle with a troll in his saga. So
why is that not in the book? There's no troll in the. Sorry.
Yeah.
You have a troll? Anyway, sorry.
So I think that kind of folk culture, folk belief certainly finds resonance in these stories. Guðmundur's saga in particular. His well consecrations, though, I think they run afoul of central ecclesiastical authorities like the Archbishop of Nidaros, less because of their pagan associations and more actually because of the ways in which holy power in that instance is so widely dispersed, right, throughout the country. So if you can just go visit one of Guðmundur's streams or one of his wells down the road, what's the point in visiting the Episcopal See or the relics at Skálholt or whatever the case might be? I think that's more the hesitation with the wells than any kind of pagan associations, actually. And Guðmundur's, he's a very interesting character, so he runs afoul of church authorities, not only thanks to this well consecrating program, but also thanks to his willingness to to take on people into the clergy who are completely unqualified for the job, as his own supporters readily admit. And he also finds himself in a long-running battle with Iceland's secular chieftains that frequently devolves into violent confrontations that basically leave the episcopal see without kind of effective government for years on end. So all of this looks a little strange, looks a little suspect from the archbishop's perspective, and hence Guðmundur winds up spending something like 8 years of his reign in exile, and like Jón Ögmundarson, according to his saga, has to seek a papal dispensation for all of this illegal conduct, which he also gets. So another instance of Icelandic clerics, on the one hand, submitting themselves to papal authority, presenting their cases before the Pope in Rome, acknowledging his decision-making supremacy over big questions in the church, but also diverting that authority for the purpose of legitimizing and supporting the cults of these rather strange, idiosyncratic saints.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things your book does so well is contextualizing the stuff, in the wider European context. So one of the things you talk about is, this is a time period, there's a centralization of papal authority and things like, so yeah, that makes sense about the wells. Like, this runs counter to the idea of we should be looking towards Rome, not looking down the block for some holy site. And then similarly, this is a time period when, like, Rome wants to have way more control over things like the creation of saints, like veneration of new saints. And many of these bishop sagas, like, they exist to justify the veneration of these particular bishops. Which then got me wondering, are any of these saints, were they recognized more broadly either then or then, like, got me wondering, like, to this day, like, are there, like, saints, would any Icelandic saint ever show up, like, in a litany in the Roman church today? But did this kind of veneration ever extend beyond Iceland?
Yeah, I can answer the modern question pretty quickly. John Paul II visits Iceland in 1980, early 1980s, and as part of that visit, the patron saint of Iceland, Thorlákur Thorhallsson, whom I discuss a bit in the book, is sort of officially brought into the catalog of saints in the church, the Roman
Was
Catholic.
that the first papal visit to Iceland?
I believe so, yes.
1980. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, and the news reports on this are kind of comical, right?
Yeah.
Precisely because it seems like such a kind of mishmash of cultures, and so one fishmonger saw this as a kind of historic opportunity to promote his business and was trying to promote it in conjunction with the Pope's visit and things like that. So that's the modern response. The medieval one is maybe a little bit more complicated. Thorlákur is the patron saint of Iceland, and there's some evidence that he was perhaps venerated a bit in Norway, maybe in the Faroe Islands as well, possibly as far afield as England, thanks to some traveling merchants. But this is all just a very small spattering of evidence for that. The other two Icelandic saints, Jón and Guðmundur, seem to have been a bit less popular even by Icelandic standards. So their cults are much more localized and particular to the Old Norse world. One point that I'd make about sanctity, though, that I think connects with another theme of the book, is that the Icelanders are not the only ones who are, for instance, drawing on imagined papal documents to argue that their particular saints had some kind of Roman legitimacy. So, for instance, there are examples from Hungary, from England, from Sweden of hagiographers who write about kind of papal canonizations of their local saints that probably or almost certainly never happened. So this kind of desire to seek legitimation from Rome and perhaps legitimation of saints' cults that were really strange, irregular, idiosyncratic in their own contexts is far from just a purely Icelandic phenomenon. I think it belongs to the broader culture of high medieval Europe at this time as well.
Yeah, and along those lines, we first met each other through this organization, the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, which is, a collection of scholars in all kinds of fields, all kinds of languages, all kinds of time periods. But what draws us together is the interest in like written, or not even written documents, but material objects, like books broadly construed. So much of your book is about these, on the one hand, these imagined documents of, popes granting all kinds of special dispensations to Icelanders for their unusual cases. But then you spend maybe even more time talking about the actual power of documentation, almost always originating in Rome, things like papal bulls, and these documents, moving through Europe into the Norse world, and the power that these documents had, in the most extreme cases, being blank documents that just have, a bull hanging on them, awaiting someone to add the authority to them. But could you speak a little bit about, not the imagined documents, but the actual physical documents that were circulating in this time period and the power that they held?
Sure, I'm happy to. This is really an era that sees, I think, a kind of exponential growth in document-based governance, much of it, I think, originating at the Roman Curia. It's an era in which the papacy is issuing thousands, or by the end of the 13th century, maybe tens of thousands of documents a year. And most of those documents are what we would call rescripts. So they are not so much plans or orders originating in Rome and then going outwards into the periphery. Rather, they're written in response to petitioners bringing their particular cases to Rome and hoping to get a document in reply to that petition. And I think this rescript nature of governance is really important for understanding the sort of conditions that the writers of the bishop sagas were working with and that they took advantage of. So they got the impression, and it's a skewed impression, but it's not too far off the mark, that if you bring your petition to Rome in hopes of resolution, you can get a document in response that will say more or less what you hope that it will say. And again, this is not entirely accurate, but it's not too far from the mark. And this was kind of driven home to me in various reading that I did for this book. But there's a particular story in the sagas of Bishop Guðmundur about a messenger who goes off to Rome in search of a dispensation for the bishop for all of his illegal and irregular conduct, and is he's stuck at the back of this hall when he enters the church, and he realizes he's not going to be able to get his petition to the Pope. So what he decides to do is throw it over the crowd and send up a prayer to the Virgin Mary that it's going to land in the right place. And then, of course, it does, and he gets the papal bull that he's looking for. So nothing seems more kind of fictitious and imaginary than this, except there's actual documentation of a pope in the mid-14th century, so the same era in which this text is being written down, actually issuing an edict basically forbidding people to throw petitions at him while he is in consistory, so while he's judging cases or while he's out riding on horseback. And so this, I think, just gives a pretty vivid impression of what the papal court, actually looked like in the 14th century in this case. It's a place that's overwhelmed by a kind of crush of petitioners, all with their documents in hand, hoping to get a papal audience of some kind. And a situation in which there's a kind of surging textuality, but it's also really quite chaotic. So, everyone in this book seems to agree that a papal bull with the Pope's leaden seal on it is this incredibly powerful instrument that deserves reverence and respect. But the kind of content to which that bull can be affixed is very much up for debate. And I think that's, again, a function of the real conditions of papal government at this time. The fact that for instance, there really aren't organized archives, so it's not as if the papacy is kind of double checking that the document they just issued didn't contradict something they said a few years ago. A situation in which Rome is kind of overwhelmed by petitioners all seeking resolution for their case. And it's these kind of conditions that I think the writers of the bishop sagas are drawing on and using to their own advantage. So there's a real, hopefully, emphasis on the actual conditions of textual production in the Roman Church in this era. In another chapter, I do a bit of diplomatic or manuscript work with texts associated with papal tax collectors that are still extant. That is, they're not imaginary, they're still with us today, and they give us, again, another sense of the Roman Church's textual production in this era. All of which suggests that it's ubiquitous, it's quite widespread, but it's also not tightly controlled and has a tendency to sort of spin off in directions and to be recontextualized and reinterpreted in ways that the papacy certainly didn't plan for.
Yeah, I couldn't help thinking about how, in addition to like so much of what you're looking at, like making sense in a broader medieval European context, also just thinking of all kinds of, like birth of modernity type of situations of, like the bureaucratic culture of just, this flood of documentary material, but then also, the like signifying power of individual documents when, these bishops are carrying around bulls, which then might be like the one document that is on display for this day. And the document alone will answer all your questions or put everything at rest.
I think there's a sense that emerges from these texts too of the degree to which there's a kind of performance around these documents that also really affects how they are received and what their impacts are. That's clear in some of the papal bulls forged and not forged around the excommunicated king of Norway, Sverrir Sigurðarson, who I discuss in the first chapter. I think it's also very much an element of the last chapter of the book on Laurentius Kalfsson, who is someone who we might term a member of like the new clerical elite in high medieval Europe. So he's low-born, but he's highly educated, and he sort of rises through the church thanks to his wits and thanks to his education and thanks to his facility with text-based government. But this means both drawing up documents and writing them out, but also kind of performing them before an audience. So getting up in the middle of a church service and making a scene to read out a sentence of excommunication against a target. And one of the points of that chapter is that sometimes these performances work as intended, but other times they kind of fall flat on their face. So for instance, Laurentius goes off to try to excommunicate this powerful Icelandic chieftain, essentially. And the chieftain has all of his local followers there, and they listen to his performance, which everyone agrees is kind of over the top. And immediately they head off and go talk to the bishop who supposedly issued this writ of excommunication and say, is that what you meant to say? Is that what you meant to say? Surrounded by a posse of 20 people. And the bishop backs down. No, my messenger. He throws the messenger under the bus, right? And so here, written government isn't this kind of cudgel, this hammer that gets people to do what the central authorities want. Instead, it's something that can fail pretty spectacularly. And that shows up in other parts of Laurentius's life as well. So that's one of the main themes of the last chapters of the book, which I'm glad we got a chance to discuss as well. Namely, the ways in which documents are kind of unpredictable and often unreliable as instruments of governance. And that's, again, I think historically significant because there is a tendency to see the sort of rise of bureaucratic and proto-bureaucratic forms of government in this era as being associated with the growth of great organizations that subject the periphery to hegemonic control. And I think the actual evidence bears out a much more complicated story.
Thank you.
I'm going to pop in now because we've got some great questions in the chat. And so thank you so much, Damien and Joel, so far for what you've shared with us. And we've got some questions here. I'm going to start actually with the first one that came in and tie it to the second one too. So a question is, how large is the corpus of the bishop's sagas? And how do they relate to the critical bibliography project? And I think somewhat related to that, what kinds of challenges did you encounter in interpreting the contents of these sagas? Are there commonalities you found among the challenges, or are they specific to each particular source?
Okay, so yeah, the corpus of bishop sagas consists of something like, let's see, there are sagas devoted to the Bishop of Holar, Jan Oakmunderson, but they exist in several different redactions, and that's true of the other stories I would mention here too. So something like, let's see, like 6 different bishops get a saga associated with them. And some of those bishops, their sagas exist in many different redactions. So it's not a huge corpus, but it's not a tiny one either. Challenges of sort of interpreting and dealing with these sagas. I think one of the challenges, but also the opportunities of these sagas is that they kind of exist in this Icelandic saga context, as Damien was talking about. So they exist in the world of the sagas of the Icelanders, and they're written at the same time as those more famous products of Icelandic vernacular literature, but they also exist in a kind of context of the European church of this era. So I see it as both a challenge and an opportunity, but it means interpreting them necessarily involves familiarizing yourself both with the world of Old Norse literature and I think with the broader culture of the Roman Church in this era. And those are different bodies of source materials, as Damien was sort of highlighting in some of his early questions, and different languages as well, right? So the bishop sagas exist, or they're still extant primarily, although not exclusively, in Old Norse. There are a few fragments in Latin, and it's possible that these sagas were much more products of Latin literature in Iceland than we know, which is to say some of them may have existed first in Latin or also exist in Latin redactions. But the fact is that what we now have is primarily Old Norse literature. So familiarizing yourself with that language and that literature is a challenge, as is the kind of bureaucratic documents of the Roman Church in Latin, which has its own difficulties and challenges as well.
Well, thanks. And then I think related to that, this question of how does this relate to the critical bibliography project? Were you dealing with in what format are you encountering these sources? And did you have to bring physical examination of them into the project? How did that work?
Yeah, the bishop sagas have been subjected to a pretty healthy dose of philological analysis already. So the kind of tradition of scholarship up to, I don't know, the early 2000s, or at least the 1990s, was a primarily philological one. So that work, that's just a way of saying that work of examining the manuscripts and editing them and dealing with the kind of physicality of those texts had largely been done. And I was very much a beneficiary of all that work. But that meant for me that that I could go off in different directions in terms of examining and thinking about material texts. So it meant, for instance, that I could deal more with the products of the Roman Church's bureaucracy in the form of papal tax collectors who were collecting taxes for the benefit of the Crusades out in places like Norway. And some of those documents are still extant in Norwegian archives. And I went and looked at them and analyzed them. But it also meant for me that I needed to think about materiality in other ways as well, as Damien was sort of highlighting, the ways in which the materiality of the document mattered to the writers of my sagas, even if those documents are no longer extant, and the ways in which that materiality was tremendously important for their sense of what papal government was, what a papal bull looked like, and how they leveraged those ideas to their own advantage. So materiality was important to this project, but maybe not in the kind of most traditional ways. Thanks.
And then again, related to that, Megan asks a question about literacy. What's the literacy like in Iceland at this time? And so how much of the real world functionality of these documents is about their contents versus how much stems from just the physical presence of this document itself?
That's a great question. I mean, it seems like medieval Iceland is a remarkably literate society, given its relatively small population compared to the extraordinarily rich and interesting literature that this tiny island on the edge of Europe, which is not at all significant economically, produces. So if that's any indication, Iceland is quite a literate place in the 13th and 14th centuries. Is it a Latin literate place? In places like Skalholt and Holar, the answer would be yes. There certainly are Latinists here who are composing things in Latin and reading and writing Latin documents. It's pretty clear, though, that when the message of those documents needs to be translated to a broader public, the document needs to be translated into Norse. And as I was saying a moment ago, I think it's fair to say that the materiality of a papal bull matters at least as much, if not more, than it's clearly an argument in the book, I should say, that Icelandic writers are much more interested in the material form of these texts, and often paying quite a bit of attention to that material form, what it looks like and how impressive it is, rather than what papal bulls actually say or are likely to say. So the form is important, but the content seems to be very much up for grabs in several different episodes that I discuss in the book.
Great. And then a question from Jack. What is the time frame of the emergence of bishoprics in Iceland and Greenland? Do they emerge among a trend of expansion or establishment of the Nordic churches in general?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jack. Bishoprics in Iceland. So Iceland is sort of brought into the Christian fold through arbitration, supposedly around the year 1000, which is to say Icelanders at the assembly kind of get together and agree that it would be best for everyone if we gave up paganism and stuck with Christianity, with certain behaviors still allowed for. But it's another 50 years or so. So it's not until the middle of the 11th century that Iceland gets its first bishopric. So up to that point, the Icelanders seem to be served by missionary bishops of various stripes. So there's one bishopric in the middle of the 11th century at Skálholt. Another one gets added at Hólar in the north in the second decade, I think, of the 12th century, which is also roughly the same era in which a bishopric is established all the way out in Greenland. And so in some ways, this is kind of part of the story of the broader growth of Christendom in this era, as charted memorably by authors like Robert Bartlett, which is to say Christendom is expanding in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And one way you can chart that is just by the growing number of bishoprics in Europe at this time. But those bishoprics being established in the far north are a bit different from the bishoprics that are being established in places like Iberia or the Baltic or in the Levant, in the sense that in those latter places, Christendom is sort of expanding at sword point, right? It's crusades in these places that are clearing the field and allowing for the establishment, or in some cases, reestablishment of bishoprics. In the northern world, by contrast, it's much more the case that Christendom is expanding through kind of negotiation and royal influence in the case of Denmark and Norway. And so this gives these northern bishoprics, I think, something of a different character, a different flavor than the other kind of new bishoprics of this era. And part of that, I think, is reflected in the kinds of stories that I'm trying to tell in this book. So in other words, yes, reimagining Christendom. Christendom looks a bit different, more interesting from the vantage point of the far north than it might look from some of these other places.
Well, wonderful. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you especially to Damien and Joel for that fantastic introduction to this book. And yes, I'm seeing claps and thank you. So I also just want to, again, remind everybody, this is sponsored by the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography. We have 6 more book parties this academic year. So flourishing of books from our society. So please join us for the next one on December 5th, when I'll be in conversation actually with Aaron Hyman about my book, The Circulating Lifeblood of Ideas, Leo Steinberg's Library of Prints, that will be moderated by Beth Yale. So thank you so much for coming, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
That would go hop over onto the other link.
Okay.
All right. Thanks y'all for being here. I'm not gonna make it to the after party, but I hope you'll have a great time. It was nice to meet you, Joel.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank
you
you for
too,
everything, Catherine.
Thanks. All right. See you later.